You are listening to the Mary Jane Society podcast, where you will meet entrepreneurs, cultivators, scientists, doctors, and inventors in the cannabis industry.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Pam Schmiel. Today we're talking about sensory science and its crucial role in R&D product development. While this methodology has been widely used for decades in the hops, beer, food, beverage, and perfume industries, the cannabis industry is just beginning to tap into its potential. Our guest today is Marshall Ligare, Ph.D., former research scientist and product development lead at John I. Haas, one of the world's leading hop suppliers. The beer and hops industry has long relied on sensory science to craft unique and consistent flavor profiles. And Marshall brings a wealth of knowledge on how these techniques can be applied to cannabis. Join us as we explore what cannabis can learn from the beer industry's deep expertise in sensory-driven innovation and how these insights can elevate product development in the cannabis industry. Let's welcome Marshall Ligare.
So I have an undergraduate degree in chemistry and an equivalent degree in biochemistry. So I actually did all the coursework for both, but they wouldn't give me both degrees because there was so much overlap. And I have a graduate degree in physical and analytical chemistry. But I did do work as an undergraduate in like biochemical ecology. So this is actually looking at aroma compounds and flavor compounds in plants that are pest deterrents, essentially. So that was kind of what started a lot of this stuff for me, especially as an aroma person, growing up. Like I like being in the woods because I like the smell of trees, right? Like it's part of my life that I enjoy. And so as much as I went into chemistry and then physics really in graduate school and in my postdoc, I ended up going back out of that academic and research oriented stuff to applied, which was hops. And there I did work for John I. Haas, building in product development, but also in plant breeding and hops breeding and development. So a lot of the fundamental work I did there was trying to correlate and look at the aroma of the hops on the field and how that translates all the way through the beer for the brewers. Because that's a long process when you're talking about trying to develop new varieties, new hop varieties, right? There's a complete disconnect between the aroma on the field, potentially, and the flavor in the beer. And it's because it goes through the processing that it goes through, especially the fermentation, right? And so the sensory side is on the beverage for us. I mean, we definitely did sensory on the hops in the field and during intake evaluation for the hop products, for the pellets. Absolutely. But a lot of the work that I did connecting sensory was through beer. And we had a trained sensory panel that did sensory on beer. We had a lexicon for that. And that was both flavor and aroma, right? So it's like upfront aroma and then retronasal aroma and bittering quality, things like that out of the hops. And so that's where there is quite a bit of a difference between the cannabis industry and the aromas and the way the product is ingested, essentially, in comparison to hops. There's a lot of overlap in the chemical composition, right? But there's not much overlap when it comes to the sensory and the lexicon that would need to be built to understand that. I think this is where a lot of people struggle still in the cannabis industry because it's been underground for so long that different people call different aromas different things in different places, right? So trying to define dank, for instance, seems to be something that's just not even a good idea at this point, in my opinion.
Trying to find what?
Define dank, for instance.
Oh, yeah.
Terms that we use because they're not even necessarily the same in different locations, even within the United States, let alone the world or different countries. So I think that's where it just needs some time to get some consensus across multiple different regions as to what to call these aromas. The other thing that I've noticed is someone who's been trained in sensory for fruits and herbs and vegetable aromas, things like that, through the hops industry, the cannabis aromas are unique, very much unique in comparison to a lot of the food and beverage sensory that's currently done in industry, right? So yes, you can have some overlap with citrus and fruit characters, but there's other components in there that are, I guess, more difficult to describe that are still pleasant, right? Like gas, and even like gas, gas station gas aromas you can get on a flower, and you're not going to ever find that pleasant in a food. So I think they're trying to describe how these things come together, and there are definitely people working on this, like for instance at the essential oil companies like True Terpenes and Abstracts. They have
Yeah.
sensory scientists working on these things and building lexicons. And I think that they're at least from what I've been able to see, making the best progress. They have brought in people from the food science and or sensory world to try to help make those descriptions, and they find people that are also interested in that product, right? Because that's another piece of it, is you bring somebody in from the food science and they don't smoke, right? They don't smoke cannabis, they don't taste cannabis, you're not going to get anywhere, right?
Oh,
They're not
that's a
going to
good
be able
point.
to spend the time and understand it in the same way, because it does take doing that sensory on it, which to me is another piece of the difficulty, right? In the sense of, well, I mean, how much sensory can you do in a single day on cannabis, especially with a panel of people, and still continue to get out the information you want from them as they continually get higher, essentially, from doing it. So I guess kind of a lot of things involved there. From just the aroma standpoint of the flower, that's much easier, right? You can definitely bring in people from herbs and other backgrounds, and they can try to help you describe these things. And they're, the interesting thing to me, I guess, aroma and sensory is very much an opinion, and it's very much an environmentally learned thing, right? So if you grew up with a family that is cooking a lot and you have a lot of these herbs in your house and you're familiar with them, you're going to be much better at picking out individual components and then trying to describe how they add together to get that aroma that you have. Um, but that's going to be different in different places in the world again. So for finding all the kind of the right people, I think it's just going to take some time. And especially when it's not federally legal or even internationally legal, right? You can't transport samples very easily. And so there's groups of people that are all putting this together, but they're all kind of siloed. And it takes getting out of that silo really to get a universally accepted lexicon, I think, for a lot of these things.
Right. I've noticed there's definitely food scientists in this industry, working on either product development, or I guess that's really it. They're all working on product development. But so you're saying that we need to look at the hops industry, which is more parallel or similar to cannabis as far as looking at sensory science.
So there is a lot of overlap chemically, right? But that's where actually I think that looking at the hops industry isn't necessarily the right thing to do for a couple of reasons.
Oh,
One,
okay.
their processing from the field through the drying is different, and it's different because it doesn't matter to them as much as to how much oil is lost. As well, the plants are, as much as there's a lot of overlap chemically, especially with the essential oils and the aromas, they're physically very different. So the hop cone itself does not have a lot of, for instance, fats, another plant material that will break down into off characters. So the different fat distribution, as well as the trichomes, are on the inside of the hop cone. And so during the processing and during the physical manipulation and separation of like the plant material from the flowers, you don't have nearly as much change in the trichomes. You don't have to do as many things to try to keep that intact and keep that state safe. And that's where cannabis has this piece where you've got to cure it right and you've got to handle it right for it to have a good shelf life and continue to have the aromas that you want from the product. So to me, that's where like I said, there's a lot of chemical overlap there, but the distribution of compounds is such that they do not really express themselves aroma wise similarly, even as just a dried flower. But even more fundamental in the processing for the product, they're completely separated, especially when it comes to cannabis will create off aromas from bad curing because of the fats and the plant breakdown is a different plant material in the flower for the rest of the structure of it, if you will. So the
So,
biochemical breakdown there is different.
so I'm wrong in even going down that road with hops in the comparison.
In my opinion, it's still off a little bit for very important reasons, but it's a place to, like you're saying, this is a place to start to move into the future, to look at least how the sensory science is done in an industry that's been doing it for a long time. Right?
Yes.
Because start to learn how they do it. What do they do for the training, right? How many people do they need? What kind of data and statistics do they use? And how do they determine whether or not a panel member is off enough, right? There's statistical ways of determining, okay, is this panel member actually not in agreement with everyone else? Because our noses and our brains are all different and we'll have different sensitivities. And so you've got to get a panel that is functioning well together to get the good data as well. And we can absolutely learn from that into how to design the sensory, evaluation. That in general is just known from sensory scientists who went to graduate school for food science sorts of things. So that is in general out there. There are people that know how to do these things. There's universities that teach how to do this, right? But we can immediately pull in people that are trained, right, from those industries, from those universities into these industries where they're actually applying.
You were saying you agree that the manipulation also starts in the cultivation. I mean, seeds, of course, you have to start with a good seed.
And absolutely it starts with cultivation.
Okay.
It starts with making good flower. If you don't get that, you don't get anything good, right? You've got to grow good flower, and then you've got it for keeping the aroma. You've got to then post-process it appropriately. For us, we have, for all the oil that we produce, it's all fresh frozen. Because like I said, curing is a touchy thing, especially at scale, and it doesn't take much to screw it up. And you've got to have a large facility to try to hang, hundreds of acres of hemp. So we don't go down that route. We have kind of product streams where we either cut the plants, go straight to flash freezing them, keep them frozen, vacuum sealed, and then extract them frozen to get those characters out. And then the other stream is selling flower that's been kilned for CBD, for medical CBD, sorts of products.
Kilned, you said?
Yeah. So that's a term from the hop industry. So there's hop kilns here in the Yakima Valley and everywhere we live out here. I think 70% or so of the world's hops are grown in a few valleys right here where we live. And they have invested a lot of money in infrastructure to get the aroma and the character right for beer, for IPAs and hoppy beers. And so what they have are, these very, very large picking machines. They have trucks. So all the hops are grown on these tall trellises and they're grown in vines. So hops are like these long vines. So it's structured a very different plant, right? And the trucks go through and cut the vines, drop them and lay them into a truck. They're driven out to a picking machine. They're strung up, and then these kind of series of scissors cut the cones, and then conveyors separate the cones from the chopped vines. The cones then go onto this huge screen bed, and a heater and a blower is basically blown up through them to dry them. And they can temperatures, the flow rates, right? So the different farms do this differently, and the different designs, the kilns. But those are in general a hop kiln, and that allows them to dry the material, in a reasonable amount of time. Because hops, like cannabis, will mold if you just try to stack it up on itself, right? It will just turn into a bad mess. So they churn them, they dry them, then they actually put them in piles on huge concrete floors. Like these are very large warehouses. They look like the size of a football field from the outside. And they turn the piles until they get even moisture. And then they compress them and bale them until they're pelletized. So they've gone through, they've been doing this for 100 years plus. I mean, obviously hundreds of years even before that, but really the modern industry does have fairly good standards even over the last 100 years, how to do this, how to create hops that will make good beer. Because it is, again, all in that growing the variety and then the post-processing. And those are some of the studies that I did actually for the hop industry, was looking at, okay, what happens if we leave these bales frozen, not pelletized, right? What do we do? What happens if we kiln at these temperatures, right? And then move these varieties into a brewing process, regardless of how quickly we pelletize them. So we're looking at each kind of stage of the process to determine, okay, what does that do to the final beer? And so I was on the sensory panel, obviously as one of the panelists, but I was also doing the chemical analysis in the lab. And so I got a unique ability to kind of look at the chemical, composition and have the sensory. And so that's really helped me in my career, especially what I do now, because a lot of what I do for quality control during harvest is I just go around smelling things, because I know if I get certain aromas that this is what's going wrong and we need to switch what we're doing. or we need to do it faster or whatever. Right? If I'm smelling the breakdown of the plant, I don't need to run chemical analysis on it. I know what it is through my aroma.
That's
So I'm a
amazing.
traveling instrument in that way, and I can do the quality control kind of on the spot. So,
That's amazing.
and honestly, that's really the most important thing for me and for what we do, and why I'm here, because I do have that background in being able to both do the sensory and the chemical analysis. And so it's another reason why I think there'll be, nice if, as I'm being involved in this discussion with cannabis. I also went to Humboldt State for undergraduate. So I was, in the cannabis industry before it was much of an industry nationally. So I saw a lot of people grow different ways and cure different ways. And at the same time was learning the chemistry. And so I do have strong background there as well. That's just now being utilized, I suppose you could say.
I just want to go off track for 1 second just to get your advice on this, because I feel like I haven't gotten a real answer for it yet. Do you think that marijuana and hemp are similar on cannabinoids, like not CBD, but the minor cannabinoids, meaning, all the beverages are made from hemp now? It's just distillate pretty much. But, when the industry starts maturing a little more, that people are going to want to demand all these other cannabinoids in there. Is hemp the same quality as far as cannabinoid and, like the benefits that we get out of marijuana?
It's a great question, actually. And one of the things, honestly, I don't know the answer to that. And one of the reasons why is because in medical and recreational cannabis, there's not much data. Right.
Yeah.
I'm somebody, if I've got, the access to journal articles, I'll go through 20 of them a day, looking at data, looking at what someone did, trying to evaluate whether or not the data is any good, one, and then looking at their analysis and then looking at the chemical composition, because I can learn a lot from that alone, from my data, right? I don't need to do all these experiments, but there's no data on medical recreational cannabis. And there's a huge variety from all the interbreeding, like all the breeding that's been done over however many hundreds of years, right? And so I think that the answer to that's probably no. There is hemp out there that is getting much, much closer aroma and quality wise to recreational cannabis by people that are continually crossbreeding right now. So almost every year we see seeds come out that are better and better. I have to tell you that a lot of the plants that we grow here, you wouldn't know the difference. So if I went out there and I harvested it and I cured it, and because I hand cure some of this stuff just to see what it does, and I throw it in my car, you would not know the difference. You would not know the difference between what we got from the record. In fact, a lot of what I make is actually higher quality when it comes to the way, I'm just curing it, hand curing it in small batches. But there's, aroma distributions across the board. You wouldn't know. I mean, there may not some things that smell like Gorilla Glue yet or something specific, right? But in general, there is, complete overlap there. And that seems to get better with every year. There's more crossbreeding to try to get hemp varieties that have those recreational cannabis aromas.
Right. And the cannabinoids. I mean, I wonder, like, what I know that obviously CBD is dominant, but like, look at all the other stuff we have in marijuana. Like, do we have that in hemp? Because I feel like, the industry might be going in the direction where we just have to do hemp, because we're not going to get legalization. And if anybody's going to survive as, having a business, they've got to be able to ship cross state lines and, D2C, e-commerce and all that kind of stuff. And beverage is taking off in that way and everybody's jumping in. So, but I've been wondering, like, but are we going to be missing the great medical benefits that we're all talking about, in hemp? So maybe there's not an answer yet. Because
I agree that not really an answer yet. I mean, it's even hard to get an answer for sure as to what is the medical benefits of either. I mean, yes, there's individual components studied and there's clinical trials even on some of it. Right?
Yeah.
Think of something like Rick Simpson oil, right? Which is just everything from the cannabis plant. That still seems to be, as far as I can tell, the magic, right? Everything in there, not just the individual components. And this is where
that's what I'm talking about.
I disagree with the pharmaceutical industry and the reductionist approach, because clearly there's enough things in there. But yes, there will be those overlaps, right? So they're between like the polyphenols and the flavanols and the fat types and things like that. There is overlap between those two plants. They have a lot of the same genetics. They have different enzyme expressions to create different distributions of the cannabinoids, but they potentially have the ability to do either. And as we crossbreed them more, they'll just become more intermixed. And from a sensory standpoint, I agree, starting with hemp is better because that allows you then to not be so siloed, right? To allow you to transport, to allow you to have a good set of 5 varieties. You say, okay, well, what do these people in New York or Maine or wherever think about this same group that we've just done the analysis on? Can we send that to them and see what kind of consensus they get on a potential lexicon, things like that. So for now, yes, absolutely, starting with hemp and hemp flower of high quality would be the best route for developing a larger kind of lexicon and agreeable language for the sensory.
So cultivation, just getting clean, good quality.
But I think starting for sensory is to be started with flower, right? Because different extraction procedures are going to extract different components, and that's going to shift the sensory as well. As you concentrate components, your nose is going to interact with it differently. So that distribution, the relative contributions of the different chemicals shifts the way that you're going to take in that aroma. So if you start with flower, try to describe that, I think that then people will understand as you make concentrates and things, how that's going to shift it. It becomes a little difficult, especially with concentrates, because the sulfur compounds specifically are way overpowering in comparison to the terpenes and the monoterpene alcohols and the other components in there. It's really the aldehydes and the sulfur compounds that are most potent on our nose. So in a flower, it may smell really nice and pleasant, whereas you get a concentrate, it might smell like burnt rubber or dog crap or something, because it's just too overpowering. And a lot of the sulfur compounds have different aromas at different concentrations. And someone who's done chemical analysis and sensory on them, I can tell you from diluting down thiols, they go from being horribly not pleasant to, as you dilute them, they turn into grapefruit and currant and mango and passion fruit aromas. But that's only at the very, very, very dilute end. In between, they're burnt rubber, they're horrible kind of aromas. And honestly, I think you get some of this from concentrates already in cannabis. I've had people bring me samples that absolutely smelled like burnt tires, and they're saying, "What's wrong with this?" And I said, "You concentrated some components there." I was like, "You did too good of a job through your processing, and that's all that's wrong with this, is that it's just too strong in these components, right?" And so that's where starting with one product, the flower, is probably the right place to start, and then extend that into the different extracts, and at the same time educate people as to what are those potential changes, because like I said, these are compounds that are in nature, but they're designed to be at these very low end concentrations. That's where they're pleasant. And at higher concentrations, there's a reason why our nose is said to run from them.
If we adopted some sort of SOP, like you said, or however the hop industry goes about their process in sensory science, applying it to what they're doing, what would sensory science bring to us if we started following that? How will it take it up another level?
We should use sensory science. I live and love to live every day because of my ability to use my nose, right? And where I live in my environment. So there's nothing else better for me in life in general, and we should be using that to develop products. There are multiple stages. It is a tricky process, and using the sensory science to then be able to inform the industry at large where these things are important. But for us in the hop industry, for evaluating beer specifically, which was probably the most important, most controlled sensory that we did, we had to have training every year. So the same group, we had the number of people was basically volunteer within the company. So if you wanted to take a half-hour break, 2 days a week or even every day of the week to go into the brewery and taste through beers and evaluate them, you could do that, and you would get the time during work to go do that, right? And that's how they set this up. But they also had to build a brewery. They had to hire multiple people like myself and other sensory scientists and folks that would interact with brewers, right, to then build this sensory team. But we had training. So if you did not show up for enough of the training, You did not get to go do the evaluations, in that sense that you needed to be trained. You needed to go through that training every year, and it was 3 weeks, at least 2, if not 3 days a week for up to an hour. So this wasn't a small investment in time, both for the company and the employee, because the employees are still, considered to be needing to get everything they're supposed to be getting done in that day. So it was almost like a lunch break in that sense, but you were still paid to be there. And so we had to have the training. You had to show up for enough of the panels. So the company understood that, some people might have a meeting on that day and can't go at 4 o'clock from 4 to 5 or whatever it is. But there was a lot of controls. So there was a lot of controls from how the beer was brewed, one, right? How it was transported from brewery to sensory panel, right? The carbonation levels, the temperature, right? All these things. So there's controls on each piece of it. There was a built-in room for sensory that had air, circulating air that was filtered, so that you were not being interfered with by the hops that were in the building. So there was a lot of things that were not only not cheap to build in, but important for getting that consistency they were looking for. Because it was built for beer for that company by a group of people that were hired sensory scientists. And that was that standard procedure we used. And honestly, they're continually building on. So even while I was there, we were developing this program. Now, when I started there, the first 2 guys who were really the ones starting it up were the ones that were there. They've since moved on to other companies, doing the same thing for other companies. And now there's another team there that's continually changing these things and monitoring how to do it and how to be more effective at it. So it's continually, evolving process even for them after many, many years. It's kind of 2 very good ways that I've seen sensory science work to give useful data. And that's a really good example of one of them, where you take untrained people, but you take a very large data set over a larger area, right? And you just look at what the data tells you. And that is the most important data, especially for larger companies, right? Because that's from the consumer. So even for the work that we did in the hops industry, right, everything was very controlled and internal. We had our own language. We did, our own training, and we did a really good job of agreeing with each other to evaluate the products and evaluate changes as we were developing products and our hops, right? But the bigger piece of this is then how did we extend what we did out to the brewers, right? And so we would do, because in any industry, I think that the sensory part is a lot, most of the time, internal. Whereas cannabis as well, it's like inherently external, right? Because we haven't been able to communicate about this stuff. So everybody had, and it's also inherently sensory because it smells good, right? There's a lot of the reason why people, I think, are drawn to it. For sure, me as an example of that. And so sensory has very much been done in the cannabis industry, right? I mean, like home growers cure based on their nose. They don't have any data. So you just go, well, I want it to taste good. I want it to smell good. And so you do everything you can to try to get to that point and learn along the way. And anyway, so that's where I guess the larger public data set is important for the product development and companies, because they want to know what the public wants, right? We can say, okay, we want to drive towards a more citrusy hop, right? And so we're going to evaluate a bunch of, beers made with different hops, and then try to pick the ones that are in this direction and then breed those, right? And so that's the kind of thing we did internally. But without that larger data set of knowing what does the public want, right? And that's where I think that even in that industry where they've spent so much time and effort in the craft beer industry, I mean, it was so siloed between Asia and Europe and the United States, and it's because the tastes are different, right? So if we're making a very, mixed berry citrus hop for beer, the Germans aren't going to want it. And vice versa. A lot of times they develop a hop and even their lexicon. So even the company that we worked within was Barth in Germany and John I. Haas in the US. It was all still one larger company. We got together multiple times a year with the R&D teams and the sensory people. And we still, after 4 years working there, never came to a consensus on a lexicon, because they disagreed with us and we disagreed with them, and they would do theirs and we would do ours. And they very much struggled to make even products from our hops right? Which were our industry hops and that were tasty that Americans wanted because their flavor and their palate and their profiles were different. Part of this I definitely learned from IFF, International Fragrances and Flavors, Flavors and Fragrances, which one it is. Basically, the largest flavor house that's ever existed and is hundreds of years old. I've worked with them as well, doing sensory and research, like fundamental research on plants, things like that. And their perspective on this stuff at that scale was very interesting because it was something I never would have thought of. And so they've gone through this evolution, right? 70, 80 years ago, maybe longer, of like, how do we really do this? And they've come to the conclusion, well, it is somewhat localized. And you do need to know your local target and really what to push for. They're even at the point where they tell us what to like, believe it or not. So when something new comes out, a new flavor comes out in a water, like a flavored water, it's because 2 or 3 years ago they had prepared that and were ready for that to go into the market at that time to create something new.
In curing, is there anything special in curing that you think that goes hand in hand with the sensory thing? Or do you think where we need to improve on that somewhere? It's like the future.
This is actually where I have seen some data, actually, which is pretty cool, on curing processes and temperatures, flow rates, airflow rates, humidity, things like that. I don't have any personal experience from that in the sense that it was all chemical, scientific literature, right? So I wasn't there to smell these flowers and these things as they were changing. There is variables there that I don't understand from just trying to do it myself, even. But it just seems like too high of a temperature, too low of moisture, and too fast is never good. And that's another part that makes it really tough to scale industrially, right? Is that it seems like the slower you do it, the colder you go, the better your results. Yeah, and so that's where, at least from what I've experienced, I do not have enough data necessarily, but it is absolutely important. You can, if you screw it up, you've taken something that could have been gold and turned it into something that is not going to be useful for aroma and has to go into another product at best, right? Another reason why we don't try to hang flowers, right? At harvest, some years it's 90 degrees, some years it's 40 degrees here and raining, right? So like our weather conditions are not such that we can just hang them in a giant barn and get reproducible output. So that's where it is tougher and tougher to do at scale without larger investment and knowledge that that's going to be worth the investment in the future, because you're talking about a giant environmental chamber to really do this at even an acres scale.
Do you think that there's any equipment, like as far as the extraction, or that we would need to also improve this? I mean, I know there's different methods like everybody's using. I mean, cold water processing seems to be the best for everything, for keeping all that stuff. But right, that's where you keep all the good stuff.
It is all, again, comes down to the variety and what components you really want from it. But I agree with you. When you just take the trichomes, right, you're taking a vast majority of what you want, especially from like a medical standpoint when it comes to relaxation, flavor and aroma, character and enjoyability. Absolutely. I think you might be missing out on polyphenols and flavonoids that would then be in the leaf material. But again, if that's not what you're looking for, you might, you don't want to smoke those necessarily. They may not even come through intact for all we know. They may just get burnt up and turn into ash in your lungs, and that's just not good for you. So, like I said, if you're making a beverage, though, I would say that you'd be missing out on some health benefits by not making a water tea out of the other components, out of the leaves, because you'd absolutely be getting a bunch of other components from that. And that I learned from the hop industry, and know that a lot of these polyphenols are actually quite good for you. And this is a lot of why we drink coffee and tea and chocolate and other things as food. But if you're going to smoke it, you might as well extract out those cannabinoids and as much of the essential oils and other things that are going to stay intact, volatile as you're inhaling them, right? In that mode of action. Anything being smoked is actually quite new. I mean, maybe Philip Morris knows these kinds of things. They didn't share this information with us a long time ago about tobacco, right? About any sensory they may have done about tobaccos from different locations in the planet, right? There may be companies that make really high-end cigars that do this kind of thing, but really, otherwise, it's kind of a new territory when it comes to product being inhaled that is still natural that you're trying to mimic, right? When you're smoking it, you are getting the retronasal character out of it after you've heated it, rather than just the aroma off the flower. So there is some parallels there between those two types and how you potentially want to go about, separating a smoked product from the aroma on the plant material coming off of, coming out of curing, whatever it is, as the product, as that part of the product. So, but it's something that, yes, like you said, a lot of people are trying to push to do this. It seems to me like a lot of the motivation seems to be, oh, we're the first ones to do this and make this lexicon, rather than can we all work together to come up with a consensus? And to me, it needs to be done the other way. That's how it's been done in the past, is through this collaboration, not through, hey, we're the coolest, we're the best, we did it first.
Yeah.
And there's just a lot of that in this industry in general. Part of it is just trying to, climb to the top. And so, I think that it's we should talk about and at least put it out there for people. Hey, maybe this isn't the best way to do it, because these are different environments that people are from, and they're not going to all agree on the sensory. So coming together, right, making a council or something in that sense, of a nonprofit that wants to do something like this, try to help develop it, is the better route, right? And the collaboration. That's what's interesting to me, is there is so much collaboration in so many other ways, and that this piece of it is not as.
That's great, because I mean, I have to say, I've heard you guys in your field, all of you, in your area, are all kind of complaining about the same thing. Just in general, I'm hearing that frustration that we need some standards, or we need to share this information. And I've asked a few people, well, how would we do that? Nobody really, or somebody, maybe like you said, a nonprofit has to take it on. I think I just heard that Oaksterdam is starting, oh God, what is it? They're working with, it's the Origins Council. So
Okay, nice.
it's out of Oaksterdam I'm sorry, UC Berkeley.
Okay.
UC Berkeley Cannabis Genomics Mapping System.
There you go. So this is kind of the thing I'm talking about, right? Is it does take involving some other industry that doesn't have any other stake, right? And saying, okay, will you guys help us to do these things? Because otherwise it's tough to get everybody together. The other thing is that the industry itself is always in its gray area. And whenever it's in this gray area, you get people that are wanting to work and run businesses in this gray area, and they don't care. That's what I've found, is they don't care. They go to name something, whatever they want, whatever that variety is. And that's the bigger issue still to me, is that we could do all this, and until it's just legitimized and legal across the board for people to do these things, you don't ever get these people out of the industry.
Yeah.
They're just living in that criminal zone where they don't really care, right? They're just there to make a profit, and they'll do anything that they need to do that. And they might as well be in any other criminal industry, yet somehow they become sort of legitimized. Unfortunately, I've seen too much of that in even the companies that we deal with in hemp.
I mean,
so that is the other issue, but it does need to be started, and it's exactly like what those guys are doing, right? Is the consensus even on a particular strain, a variety, and what the origin should be done well.
Yeah, and also because there's so much it's been lost in the generation and the crossbreeding and all that kind of stuff. And if we don't have some sort of a record, like, they are starting that. So the origin, it's saying, like, what part of the country, it says, so they can map it out for terroir and appellation, so we can get to be like the wine industry eventually. How can we get even to where we are with the sensory science that we're talking about?
When the breeding actually is faster than the sensory can move forward. And that is another issue with this industry. I mean, if I go to the recreational shop here, which is not very often, every time I'm there, there's literally not a strain that I've ever heard of, because every grower is coming out with 5 new ones every 6 months, because they've just crossed everything else they had. And I kind of look at it and I'm like, well, okay, to me, it's already gone too far and moves really fast. And so from a sensory standpoint, but it's again, if you start with the basics, if you have the training and you can understand the composition and the basics that go into that, it doesn't matter how many times they crossbreed it. All that shifts is the distribution of components and what's expressed. And you should hopefully be able to explain that through the sensory work that can be done from the bottom up. So it's still, not like it's all lost in that sense. You should still be able to use all the same language to describe them. Yes, now and again, you're going to come up with a new aroma, a new combination of things. It's like, okay, well, that's outside of our lexicon. How do we describe that now? And we ran into that in the hops industry. Absolutely, right? We started making hops that had aroma characters and fruit flavors that didn't exist, that were from a single vine out in the field in the middle of 1,000 acres. And we're going, this one's unique. But that's what we were doing, right? That's why we were there, to find those and see if that's repeatable in the next year's environment, and select those, move on with them, and then create the diversity that we wanted. So
and like, what is your you're in the hemp space, but you're creating oils for the hemp industry, for creating products. You're selling the oils, right?
For the most part, at least in what we deal with hemp, right? It's the aromas that we are potentially shooting for are very much product dependent. We use CO2 extraction for that, and CO2 extraction is a little bit different than hydrocarbon in the sense that it pulls everything. So if you've got off aromas in there, it takes it all in. And so for me, a lot of the work that we have to do for good essential oil, for instance, to extract and concentrate, is on the farming and the processing side almost completely. Yes, you have to be careful with the material the entire way. But it's kind of like, for us, it is very much dependent on, we do the whole process depending on the final product we're trying to make with that, and how touchy we really need to be, right? Because that scale, trying to hang cure for weeks, hemp flower just is something that unless there's a specific need or customer who wants that and is willing to work with us to develop that, it's pretty much impossible. And so we use a lot of hop industry stuff like kilns, right? In those cases, we're just burning off the aroma and we're getting CBD out. So, but from a recreational cannabis standpoint, right, that's where I think a lot of the industry still struggles with some consistency in how they dry, and that the curing part is everything, right? If you've grown good flower, curing is all, and then packaging and storage after that as well has lots to do with it. And of course, there's different regulations state to state, and so you get different things, different places for sure. So I spend less time doing kind of what I think, and kind of listening to customers and saying, okay, what is it you want? Can we make that in a reasonable amount of time? And for me, most importantly though, I am here for medicine, right? I absolutely know way too many people where CBD and or THC has helped them in their life, if not saved their life multiple times. And so as a medical benefit, if I can help grow good hemp here that I know has been processed, right, without solvents, hasn't been sprayed with pesticides, and we can get that out in bulk as an extract that can go into edibles, that's why I'm here. That's where I know that I can help contribute and help get quality control. And because, like I said, there's too many people, too many companies out there that don't seem to care. And put products out they're going to destroy their own industry with, because they either don't work or else. And so the one thing I can do is use my knowledge to get actual real things out to people. And that's my real day-to-day strive to do this. And in the meantime, if somebody wants something specialty like we did with these oils, show them how to make it, right? Or how difficult or how easy it was.